Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Daryn, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. I'm going to have you reintroduce yourself for everyone out there listening.
Thank you, Robbie. I'm so glad to be back. Last time was a lot of fun. So I'm sure this will be just as fun, if not more fun. But I'm Daryn Kirscht. Last time we talked about my book, The Snyderverse Saga, which covers the Zack Snyder movies and the DC movies that he did specifically, from Man of Steel all the way up through Zack Snyder's Justice League a couple years ago. And then I'm also a host of my own podcast called Round Two, the film sequel, where we cover the second movie in a film franchise or trilogy. And we live the magic of returning for the sequel, as we say. So those are the two big things for me, and I do all that under my own company called Oak Valley Media.
Now, sequels, they don't usually, I mean, in your opinion, do you think that they usually hold up to the original?
Yes and no. It
Okay.
depends. It depends. It varies greatly. I'll put it that way.
What would be like a favorite movie in a franchise where the sequel really held up?
The Dark Knight.
Okay.
I
Okay.
mean, it's tough to top that.
Now, is it just specifically you look at like superhero movies or you're looking at anything that comes with a sequel?
Anything, any movie sequel. We've covered all kinds of different movies from the sequel to Bill and Ted to the sequel to Man of Steel. So we've covered comedy, horror, action, you name it.
Now, what would be the purpose of a sequel? Obviously, fans really love the first movie so much that they want another take of it. And then there's another one that gets created. But then we got Bill and Ted. That first one was like legendary. The second one, a lot of people did not like it. They were ready for it only because they waited so long. It's kind of like my fear right now. They're making a Kung Fu Hustle 2. And I love the first one. And I'm like, don't screw up the second one because the first one, I'm pretty sure like 100 people must have broke their back filming that thing because they did not pull out any punches. Where I'm like, how are they going to match that? I mean, at least the it's so bad it's good version, I should say.
It is interesting because I feel like a lot of my favorite movies in a weird way are the sequel to the original. And I think of all the incredible movie sequels that we've had. I mentioned The Dark Knight, The Empire Strikes Back for Star Wars, the original sequel before we got all the other stuff. I mean, even like the second Pirates of the Caribbean movie is a great movie. The second Godfather movie, like the list goes on and on. That a lot of these movies, like even Rocky 2, for example, is one of my favorite movies, my favorite in that franchise. So there's so many of these movies that I really like the second movie because it's especially if it's tied to the original, it kind of is like an extension of the original, but at the same time, it can still be its own story. So that was kind of like the birth of the podcast in my mind was like, man, I really like a lot of the second movies in a franchise for some reason, or like the middle of a trilogy. Like the second Lord of the Rings, for example, Two Towers. Another really good movie. So, and some might argue that the third one's the best. I think they're all great. So, that's kind of like, and it's tough because like with a sequel, sometimes, there are like those like quick cash grab, like that's just repeat, do the same thing we did in the first one, swap out a couple names or whatever, right? There's those really cheap sequels that aren't good whatsoever. Probably one of the most interesting conversations I had on my podcast was covering the sequel to Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which is called Turbo. And huh, not a good movie, but it made for a really interesting conversation.
Do you
So
think that a sequel needs to have the same director? Like if we talked about like either even film cast as well too. Like if you try to watch Pirates of the Caribbean, a sequel to that, the second one, if they would have just recasted Johnny Depp's character, would people still enjoy the second movie because there's Johnny Depp's not Jack Sparrow anymore?
hmm, that's a good question. I think it depends. In terms of like a cast member, I think it would probably harm the sequel more if you changed a cast member, especially like one of the main characters, like you mentioned Johnny Depp as Captain Jack Sparrow. He's the most iconic character in that franchise. So, I mean, right after the popularity of the first one, you mean you can't just replace that character, you know? I mean, could you imagine if they replaced Christopher Reeve for Superman 2 after the first Superman movie? You know, like it, even Michael Keaton came back for Batman Returns. So I feel like, you know, could they replace Han Solo after the first Star Wars movie? Uh, I just think with a cast member, it would be a lot tougher with a main character. With the director, I think it's a little bit different. I think as long as you have a good take and you're, you know, obviously like respectful to what the original was and whatnot, I think it could work. I don't think a director, it's helpful and it's really nice, but I don't know if it's 100% like it needs to be that person. I think it more so depends on how you're going about it and what kind of a take you're going to have on that story.
Do you think with superhero films, it's the only kind of franchise genre that can be kind of interchangeable when it comes to their characters? I mean, we don't have a constant, I mean, the best example would be we don't have a constant Fantastic Four film. There's not, it's just been, there's the Silver Surfer 2, which I mean, that would be the second Fantastic Four, sure, which was all right. It wasn't like the worst movie in the world, but then you got all these different Fantastic Fours that started coming out with different casts. There wasn't something that people could connect to. And that's mostly because Chris Evans, who played Human Torch, went over to another film series. Jessica Alba ended up stop acting to have her kids and everything like that, and then picked it up later. But there was a lot of things where the original cast dropped off, where they just restarted the whole movie franchise over again. And now it seems like we're on this cycle that it's just over and over and over and over again, which makes me think like people want to connect to a movie, connect to a film. If you're watching the second version of that movie, like the continuing on, you want to see the same people you connected with in the first one. You definitely don't want to see a whole new cast unless they just did something like Quentin Tarantino, where they give it like a whole, hey, it's the second movie, but really it's nothing to do with the first movie. It was actually before the second movie.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It actually makes me think back to the last Oscars that we just had when they had that bit with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito when you know when all of a sudden like they were like teasing Batman and all of a sudden they show Michael Keaton in the audience, you know, still pretending to be Bruce Wayne saying, you know, bring it on. It makes me think of that, you know, and I think it's something that the MCU has really been dealing with the last few years, ever since Endgame, pretty much, because I think they underestimated just how important Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans were to this franchise. And, you know, when you build everything to that, to those last two movies with Infinity War and Endgame, you know, obviously they were this huge pop culture uh, thing where like everyone was talking about it, and it was the end of such a huge and successful a run of films in the MCU, which is something that has never been done before on that scale, on that level, and probably never will be, to be honest, because I mean that's like lightning in a bottle to be able to do that with all those actors for all those movies, and for a lot of them to be a financial success to keep doing this, you know, and whatnot. So I think when once we hit Endgame, and that was kind of like the end of that story arc of all those movies, I think they've had a really hard time because, you know, I think people really gravitated towards Chris Evans as Captain America, Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, Scarlett Johansson, right, as Black Widow. Um, I think when a lot of these characters either didn't return or at least not in the way that we knew and loved them, I think it kind of hit in a different way. And I think streaming might be a part of that too, with all the Disney Plus shows. I think it became too much for people. Whereas when you have one or two movies a year, that's doable. But when you have, you know, four Disney Plus shows a year and extra movies and stuff, and a Black Widow prequel after Endgame for some strange reason, that is like I don't. It was really confusing, I think.
Do you think there's still the obsession with sequels, even in today's time with the advent of streaming services? It seemed like when before streaming services really took off, like when you saw Blockbuster and things like that, when you heard a second movie coming out of your like favorite movie, you were, I'm going to buy a ticket as soon as it comes out, and it would get so much like box office draw. But now it's like, I'll wait till it hits the streaming service, or I'll wait till it goes onto this. And it just seems like there's not so much of a push by the public to want a sequel to these movies anymore. It's cool if it's there and they come across it, but they're not like checking every single day the newspaper or anything like that looking for it, which in my opinion stops the directors from wanting to create a second one because like, well, people obviously aren't asking for it. It's like, well, nobody knows that they want it yet.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I think of, like back in the past, like you mentioned, and you mentioned Blockbuster. I mean, that got me really excited to hearing that. Good times, even though
Do you still have your card?
no, I was a little young at the time. My parents always brought me to our local video store to rent like VHS, like all the Batmans and Supermans and stuff and whatnot. But it's interesting that you bring that up though, because what with sequels in the past, like the first one will be a success. The next one would be an even bigger success because they're like, oh, we definitely got to go see that second one now because that first one was such a big deal. You know, I mean, the second Harry Potter movie, Chamber of Secrets, exceeded the box office of the first one, even though like people usually revere the first movie probably more than the second one. I think they're both great, but hey, whatever. But the second one, it did even better at the box office because they're like, oh, we definitely got to go see this next one now, you know. And I think that was the case with a lot of movies back then. But nowadays, like you mentioned with streaming, and with sequels, and I think a big part of it is that for one, there's so much content now out there, and when it comes to sequels, I think a big problem is the release window. They're in theaters for a shorter amount of time, and it's like a month later, these movies are going up on streaming. Who's gonna go out to the movie theater and pay, 50 to $100 to go watch a movie? And have to deal with people who are on their phones and talking and all this during the movie the whole time when they could just wait a month and watch it at home on a streaming service that they're already paying for. That's going to be way cheaper and they're just in the comfort of their own home. So I think that's part of the problem too. And I think, for example, I think Disney is kind of, I don't want to say course corrected, but I think they made a really wise decision with Inside Out too. It just came out. And Disney said like it's if you're gonna want to watch it, you have to watch it in movie theaters for like the first, I don't know, 2 or 3 months. It was gonna like before it was gonna go to Disney Plus. So it'd be a longer wait, which is how it used to be back in the past. If you wanted to go see a movie, like you had to go see the movie theater, or you're gonna have to wait 4 to 6 months to see that movie when it comes out on DVD, right? And so Disney's saying, "Hey, this is gonna be a longer window. Like you have to wait longer to see it." So now everyone's going to the movie theater to see this movie, and now it's the top grossing movie of this year already. So I think that should really be like a telltale sign.
I think it's a prejudgment call because we're only 6 months in, almost 7 months in. To call it but they'll give awards like New York Times bestseller on the first day of the year or something like that. I'm like, well, yeah, it's the first day. Wait till the 364 other ones come up. Uh, but when you talk about streaming services, what I notice is that it really killed the cinema experience. Where I think that's why we have the rise of superhero movies. And let me toss this out to you because you technically do study fandom if you're looking at your book and how the Snyderverse stuff focuses on a lot of the fandom, the people that love the Snyderverse or love Zack Snyder's movies compared to the people that really don't or have just this opposite effect. When we talk about fandoms now are like that's what movies are being created for now, and that's the superhero movies. And I think that's because of streaming services, because it was a big risk now to make a whole new movie with a whole new plot line or something that's going to be catchy where you're going to spend a bunch of money advertising and then no one shows up to the theater. For instance, the new movie with Henry Cavill, the Gentleman League of Extraordinary Gentlemen or something like that. Have you seen it?
I have not.
It's not bad. It's just like you don't expect you're there for Superman to be 100% honest with you. But it's their original I think payment for the movie was 68 million or something like that. It was a high amount of money they spent making this film. Their box office returns was only 28. And that's with a lot of movies you see after the whole pandemic. Every single movie that was coming out that wasn't like some type of superhero movie was not trending and was not getting the views because people were just waiting for it to hit the streaming services. Where I go, why would our directors or any producers or any studio take a risk of losing money when they know their cash cow now is superhero movies? Because no matter what your fandom base is, you're going to show up to watch one of your favorite superheroes or one of the just that area, that fandom base. Even if it sucks, then you'll complain that Madam Web was like the worst thing you've ever seen. I saw it. It was rough. It was rough. I was about 20 minutes in. I'm like, I can see where everyone's getting the hate.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic to discuss. I feel you with like Madam Web and Morbius, and it's kind of something that I've been kind of down on WB on for a while because a lot of their movies really felt like they were made for like the most common denominator, the most, and they made their movies into the most bland kind of a movie where it's like they're trying to appeal to like the general mass audience, and it and by doing that it appealed to absolutely nobody, and except for maybe like young kids maybe. So I think that was been kind of been my critique, I guess you could say, if that's the right word, of a lot of the more recent movies that they've done. To be honest, I really liked the Batman with Robert Pattinson and Matt Reeves. I wish we get a sequel to that one, but that one also seems to be either in jeopardy or in a long delay, if you will, unfortunately. So I think it's tough though when you say like superhero movies are the ones that they're clamoring for because in certain cases, yes, like it is absolutely the case. I mean, Deadpool and Wolverine, can't wait for that movie, when it comes out. There are certain movies like, you look at the box office, a lot of the bigger movies are like the big IP kind of movies. And, when it comes to superheroes and stuff, but at the same time, a lot of them have flopped, you know. You look at movies like you mentioned, Madam Web. I mean, look at the last Aquaman movie, didn't do well. Blue Beetle didn't do well. The Flash didn't do well. Um, the last Ant-Man movie didn't do well. Sure, Guardians of the Galaxy 3 did okay. But I don't think it was nearly what the other ones were.
Oh man, I thought that was
So,
the best one.
no, I mean like in terms of like box office, not in terms of quality, in terms of
Oh,
just like how much it brought in as I guess where I was going with that. Uh, but yeah, so I think it's kind of like a double-edged sword in a way because I think it really depends on what kind of a movie that you're trying to make and like how big of a deal it is because when you turn out a bunch of movies, uh, I think it depends on the take that you have, I think, and that's kind of the most important thing.
do you think that the public or the fans, the people that go and buy cinema tickets and go see a movie, even if it's a new movie that they've never seen before, there is a risk as a studio to try and please them, which is the overall goal, so you can get money to fund more films and be able to just make a profit. But I feel like the public, I mean, I would ask you this, but do you think they do a service to it or disservice? Only because there's a lot of things that's unpredictable in the people's mind, whether they're going to love a film or reject a film. And if you talk about a movie being stuck up in production or we don't know the end time or release date on it, because if the Robert Pattinson's Batman, I think they're just saying that because they don't know if a second one is going to get the publicity that the first one did. And the first one didn't even do super well. It did okay. A lot of people couldn't separate the Twilight part from Robert Pattinson playing Batman, but I liked it. I just thought it was really, really long. But there was like that kind of thing where it's like, let's just say we're going to be holding this idea for a while. We might not ever get a second version of that, only because they might feel there's too much of a risk. You have a lot more money to lose than people returning to go watch the second version, despite even if you liked it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Um, that's tough. I don't know. I mean, because when you think about like, there was a movie called like I think it was called Anyone But You, or like The Fall Guy, or a lot of these other movies, which are, from everything I've heard, good movies. But who's going to want to go to the movies to see that when they can see a movie similar to that, or wait, a month or two and watch it on streaming. I think those kind of movies, they aren't event movies. They aren't the kind of movies that are gonna bring everyone together in the movie theater. Like, for example, Avatar: The Way of Water. That was an event. That was an experience. That was something that you had to go to the movie theater to experience. And everybody did, you know? And now it's, up there with the other James Cameron films as among the top box office earnings ever, you know? So I think that's the most important thing when it comes to these movies is it has to be an event. It has to be an experience. It's something that it's like you have to go to the movie theater to see. If you want to see Deadpool and Wolverine, you're gonna have to go to the movie theater because you want to see Ryan Reynolds back as that character. You want to see Hugh Jackman back as that character, right? I'll touch back on something from my book. If you wanted to see Batman and Superman on the screen together for the first time outside of animation, like in live action, you had to go to the movie theater to watch it, you know? And for at least for that first weekend, a lot of people did. The other weekends, maybe not so much. But if you wanted to see, Christian Bale's last take on Batman at the end of the Dark Knight trilogy, you had to go to the movie theater to watch The Dark Knight Rises, you know? So I think it has to be an experience, it has to be an event, it has to be something that's like you have to, and I think people are hesitant to go to the movie theater if it's not something like that, unless there is like this really, really, really big buzz, kind of thing. I mean, look at this last year, the Barbenheimer or whatever they called it with Barbie and Oppenheimer. But both of those movies sharing the same release date. Everyone thought that was going to be a disaster for both of those movies. And then because of like the pop culture thing, they're like, oh, these two movies that are like polar opposites are together, and like they made it an experience where they're going to go see both the same weekend, and it became this big trend and this really big thing online. And then they were two of the top three movies at the box office last year. So
The
I
only
think
time we
that's
ever had
just
that was when The Dark Knight came out. There was another movie that trended with The Dark Knight that was like the complete opposite of The Dark Knight. I'm forgetting what it's called, but they mashed those two hashtag or not hashtags, they mashed those two names up together too. And I was like, well, that was like 2012 or 2014 last time that happened. So it was that long, like again, event thing that you mentioned, which is a really, really good point. I do agree with you 100% on that. But did you realize how quickly that changed with the cinema? It never used to just be events. It used to be that's where you went to get a movie. Now
and
it's like,
it's where you went to go to see movie trailers
yeah.
before they would go on YouTube.
And now it's like we only go to movies now for an event. I mean, what does that do for this? I mean, what's your thoughts on the cinema experience? I think it's important, but I think, after or before the pandemic, we didn't really care anymore. I mean, it went from before streaming services, movie review sites. People are getting their insight off social media to depict if they want to go see this movie or not. A lot of people are. For me, I'm like, look, I like all the crappy movies. Like Green Lantern was like my favorite. And Ryan Reynolds has openly spoken about how he hated that doing that movie. But I love I'm not a hard guy to please. There just are some movies that I don't know. I sit in it and I go, damn, you guys wasted a shit ton of how much? 300 million? Oh my God, we could have cleaned up homelessness.
Yeah, yeah. The interesting ways you can spend the money, right? Um, yeah, I think in terms of like this experience, I think the thing to think about is like I've always said when it comes to watching a movie in the movie theater, like the movie can suck. It doesn't matter. The experience for me is still worth it. I always enjoy going to the movie theater. And I feel bad because the last couple of years I haven't really gone like anywhere near as much as I used to. Uh, but at the same time, though, like if it's a big movie, I'll go. And I think maybe a lot of people are feeling that way too. And I think it's tough because when you have all these movies that are being made, I mean, I think they're saying more movies are being made now than ever in history, and just more content in terms of like TV and whatnot as well. And when a lot of these movies aren't doing well financially, it's tough because then they're like, okay, like movie theaters are like, we need the big blockbuster event movies to get families and get people in the movie theater. But then, at the same time though, like the flip side of it is like the benefit of streaming is that, hey, you know, we don't have to worry about this being a huge box office success. We just need like viewership, and it's a lot easier from, sitting on your couch. So I think, and because of that, they can gear things to be more creative and be more filmmaker friendly in that aspect. And it's not just about dollar signs, it's about making something that's interesting or different. And unique. And I think that's where like especially TV, like I think that's where that's been really, really successful with streaming. So I see both sides of it, unfortunately. But it is tough because like the movie going experience is so important, and to see it struggling the way it is, it's tough. And you know, one of my best friends, his family owns a like a small independent movie theater, actually a couple of them now, in central Minnesota. And you know, he was telling me that, you know, sometimes like so how what it happens is like the movie studios will, you know, let the theaters, you know, show the movie, and then like there's a percentage of that of that movie ticket, that money goes to the studios, and then like the theaters, they keep like a small percentage of that, or a percentage of that, I should say. Lately, it's been kind of a small percent because some certain studios, like Disney, for example, like when Star Wars was in theaters, they would take almost the entire thing and say, like, this is a huge movie, like we're gonna like they would request like almost all of that percentage goes to them for that movie theater ticket. So the theaters aren't really making money off of the movie tickets themselves. They're making their money from concessions and stuff like that. And that's what's making it really tough is sometimes like for some of these movies, you know, like they're not really getting that unless they get like tons and tons and tons of people in the movie theater to justify that, it's becoming a lot more difficult in that aspect too.
Did you ever think the cinema experience was dead?
I think it could be on its way to being that way, sadly. I know a lot of movie theaters, well, at least a couple in my area, are kind of you know, aiming more towards like throwbacks and stuff like that. Um, like there's one actually nearby where I live where they do this like year round where they'll show like throwback movies like favorites, like they'll have like Back to the Future, and like, you know, Indiana Jones and stuff like that, and they'll have all these older movies that are, you know, cult classic fan favorites, and they'll, you know, have showings of them and market them to the public, and people will show up for it almost more than new releases sometimes. So I think that it could be like that. I just wish that that wouldn't happen. And then you know, hearing that Sony bought, I think it was Alamo Drafthouse, those movie theaters, that's really interesting too because I know I can't remember the last time a studio actually owned movie theaters, and how like all the Sony movies are probably going to get like the preferential treatment for those movie theaters. But then again, they're investing in the experience, so it's really complex. It's really complicated.
I've watched like three different movie theaters in my town just get shut down. And the latest one was just a couple of years ago after I think it was like the first year they opened back up after the pandemic. And it was one everybody went to. But then I started seeing that the industry kind of fixes itself. When it notices a problem, it might take a while, and hopefully those theaters can last. But then you have the rise of independent music festivals or independent music screenings that are starting to produce like whether they're local or just independent documentaries or something like that. Those events that people will just spend $5, $10 to go see a film that it might be good, might be bad, and it completely just revolutionizes their faith in going back to the cinema industry because they're not something you can see on Netflix, whether these people don't have an in on Netflix or they don't have an in on Amazon Prime. So I think the industry works itself out, but to me, it's just complicated because you can watch it change so rapidly. And then with something as sensitive as that, the smallest little thing, whether it's a tweet from a famous critic, whether it's a tweet from an actor, whether it's like the controversy with Chris D'Elia in that zombie movie that came out that they put on Netflix, where they just CGI'd his face and replaced it with Tig Notaro. I mean, there's those sensitive events where like the studios are now thinking about it because they know the people are probably thinking about it. And then it creates this whole paradigm where I'm like, and this is a good question for you because it kind of hits a little bit close to home. But if Zack Snyder was going to make a sequel to his movies, any of them, when it comes to like Batman versus Superman 2, well, they start fighting again. I don't know. But there's just something. Do you think it would still have the impact? If there was a Watchmen 2, do you think people would sit in those seats to watch it and get the same reaction that they got from the first one? Because I think that was a one and done thing, and I'm a giant fan of the Watchmen, but I would not be banking on a second one.
Really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, you know, it's and first off, you mentioned the zombie movie, and replacing with Tig Notaro. That was actually Army of the Dead, directed by Zack Snyder.
No
Believe
shit,
it or not.
really.
Yes.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that was his first Netflix movie that he did over there. It came out just a couple of months after his cut of Justice League did. And yeah, it was because of the controversy with him, and then they ended up having to reshoot all those scenes, but only with I think it was Tig Notaro, and then like then they had to like literally like add her into those scenes, but it was done so seamlessly that like I wouldn't have if I didn't know about that, I don't think I would have noticed. So I thought that was kind of clever how they went
I only
about.
noticed because there wasn't anybody standing from the original scenes. There wasn't anybody standing near her when they were doing that. Usually they show the pilot shaking somebody's hand or something like that, or they're in the same scene together. Every shot with her was a cutaway from the original thing. So it was like, oh, they just grabbed a new person, told them to stand in front of this helicopter, and then act like the other cast was on the other side that the camera's on. So then you could just shoot all these scenes and it just flows together pretty seamlessly, which they did. But for me, I was noticing, I was like, that's why she's not in any of these scenes with anybody. And she's like talking to herself in a room like she's talking to the people. I'm like, that's got to be awkward as an actor.
Right? Yeah. So that was kind of a fun tidbit. I forgot what was the question though.
I probably forgot it too, but no, the question was talking about when it comes to the sensitivity, when it comes to this cinema experience, but then we get into Zack Snyder making a second version of his films.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah. Like if he would make a sequel to Watchmen and what the reaction would be. Well, it's interesting because like there was a Watchmen TV show, which I don't think I think he was initially going to be a part of, but that was right around the time of like the Justice League stuff that was happening. So he wasn't officially a part of that. And then now I hear that there's a Watchmen animated movie or something like that, which looks pretty much like the movie he made, but it's just an animated form, but he's not attached or involved with that, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I think with him, I think it's really interesting because a lot of his movies, I mean, they have been financially successful, whether they're originals, whether they're sequels, whether they're adaptations. A lot of his movies have been, I mean, pretty successful. One of the executives who used to work at Warner Brothers, his name is Greg Silverman. He, was a part of a lot of the Zack Snyder movies over when he was over at Warner Brothers before DC, during DC, and I think he stepped down right around the Justice League time. It might have been right after, uh, but he had said online when people are like saying like someone was saying that like, oh, Zack Snyder doesn't do well at the box office, his movies suck, blah blah blah. And he was like, well, only two of his movies didn't really bring back a profit, that being Sucker Punch and Legends of the Guardians, Owls of Ga'Hoole, the owl movie. So he's like, those are the only two that like didn't bring in money, that weren't profitable. So every other movie he's done's been profitable, just to varying levels of success. So I think, and because he is a director who has a big following, also with fandom, and also with like the press and the media and their inability to stop fixating on him in strange ways. I think because of that, I think whatever he does is going to get a lot of attention either way. I think of like, I mean, look at Rebel Moon. When with the press leading up to Rebel Moon, all of a sudden, like he's at the front of a magazine and all these interviews and whatnot, and like and whatnot. So there was a big push for it, and obviously, like some people aren't a fan, and they can't help but try uh to do this, and like whether it be like the headline of an article, whether it just be like hashtags online, there seems to be like this strange hate for the guy, which anyone who's ever worked with him has always really liked him. So I think whatever he does, it seems to be like one of those things where like there's a lot of attention to it regardless. So I feel like whatever he would do, he could do a Watchmen too, whatever and I think he would probably he would only do it if he had an interesting way that he felt like he could do it. And if that's the case, I feel like people are going to show up and people are going to at least be interested. For what reason they're interested could vary, but I think with him, I think it would, whatever he's going to do, I think is going to get eyeballs.
In your opinion, who overall has the power to create a new film or film in general? Would you consider it being the studio or the fan base?
An original film. Well, there's not a lot of them, and I think it varies on like when it comes to original films, like what the goal is. Is it this like a low budget? Is it horror? Is it
Not even just original, just another film of a, it could be a remake of a film that's already out. That's fine too. But I try to understand what depicts it more. Obviously, the studios have the money that they toss and make the film, but the fan base is where the money comes from. They're expecting profits if they're gonna. It's like a gamble. You're loading all this money in to see what's gonna come out. And if I don't see people tweeting about we need this movie or we need this movie, the next thing I know, that movie's being made. I think Rush Hour 4 has been in progress for however long, and I'm sure we'll get a Step Brothers 2 at some point. But I just don't know. I was like, I want the studios to kind of grasp the wheel, like I've seen Zack Snyder do with his movies, where he's like, this is my image of what I want to make this movie. You guys can like it or you don't have to like it. And that's where I've seen a lot of directors be successful, like Quentin Tarantino and many others, where the director has the power. But overall, their movie gets funded by a studio.
yeah, that's really interesting. The studio or the filmmaker or yeah, that's really interesting. I think it depends. There's a lot of filmmakers who are either younger or are working their way up or whatnot, and they aren't like a household name, like a Christopher Nolan, Quentin Tarantino, uh, Denis Villeneuve. Like a lot of these guys who are, wildly, just like huge, huge, successes, and like you think Spielberg, right? You think of these guys who are top tier, A-list directors, as you would call them. uh they're the ones that are the draw, but a lot of times a lot of directors aren't there yet, they haven't got their big break, or they, when they did, it didn't go so well or whatever, right? And they don't have that say, they don't have the power. And it's unfortunate because in that case it is the studio. So I think it does vary. I think Christopher Nolan is a great example. Like he can do an original film, he can do a remake, he can do a biopic, he can do a comic book movie. It doesn't matter. Like it's his approach and the way that he does it. And he's, a lot of these directors, like they've proven that like, hey, like this is the way I make a movie, and that's what people want to see. That's what people show up for. And so I think that's the key, I think. And the tough part is when it comes to a studio, a lot of times they're just thinking dollar signs. They're not necessarily thinking like, trying to make this as high, the best quality it can be. They're thinking, how can we make this in a way that's entertaining and make money, and get people invested in it? Um, which sometimes I think it's strange because making a great movie is the best way to do that. But it's just it's a very interesting and complex kind of idea, I guess.
Do you think studios should take more time to look online instead of doing like just see what's trending, but try and spend more time asking people what they want to watch?
I mean, it wouldn't hurt. I mean, I'm sure they have to have an idea of what people are
I bet
saying
there's a
and stuff
couple
like that.
people that are working on the algorithms trying to figure out how to make this thing give them some information or data on it. But to me, I always just wondered if like Warner Brothers just sent out a tweet like, "Hey, would you guys want to see Bad Boys 2 or something like just something that's different or that's kind of like something that they liked, a Kung Fu Hustle 2. I would have loved to see Warner Brothers or anybody offer up to make that movie. Do I expect it to be good? No, but I'd love to go see it. But to me, it just, I don't know, we need personalization as people, especially when it comes to our interactions, but also we like to have that with businesses to an extent. Sometimes we like the false, just changing a profile picture and stuff like that to match a certain thing. But mostly people want to know that their studios are actually interested in what the people offer as an opinion.
Exactly. And I think that's the most important thing. In the world that we're living in with AI, and like you have to imagine that like there's all kinds of data and analysis, and well, the numbers, the analytics show us, that whatnot, that I think there's so much of that nowadays. I mean, they have to at least have an idea. I think the problem is that and maybe problem isn't the right word, but I think they want to always be in control of the situation, and I don't think they want to like promise something or tease the idea of something, and then, for example, if they don't go through with that, then all of a sudden there's a lot of people mad at them, right? And I think it's because like they don't want to open that door to backlash in a certain sense. They're so afraid of it that they're not willing to sometimes take the risk that's necessary to make, you know, more money or to make, you know, a great film. You know, and when you make great movies, a lot of times they get nominated for Academy Awards. And and so I think there's benefits to that. The benefits to making a great movie, for the most part, I feel like outweigh the risks of or whatnot. And I think sometimes, like you said, like the the personability of these, of we want things that are personalized. I think a lot of times people gravitate towards stuff like that. Look at A24. They have built like a little empire based on all these small, lower budget movies that are more like art house, kind of more character driven kind of stories that are more unique. And, they aren't these big budget, popcorn flicks or whatever. Like they're these unique stories and people are showing up for them and they're becoming a bigger and bigger, bigger success. So much so that Dwayne Johnson's going to be in an A24 movie, you know. Zac Efron was in an A24 movie this past year and did an incredible job. And a lot of people were praising him and praising that movie. And
Was
so
that the
I
Ricky
think,
Stenicki movie
yeah, it was the
with
Iron
Andrew
Claw.
Santino and John Cena was in it?
I think the one with Zac Efron was called the Iron Claw.
Oh, the wrestler movie. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yep. Um, which I almost thought he could have been up for an Oscar, but it's tough. That could be a whole different debate with like, who should be nominated for Oscars and
You
who
don't
should.
get an Oscar with a hairdo like that in the movie. Just letting you know.
Yeah, almost like He-Man. But yeah, so I think I don't know. That's just my thoughts, I guess.
I would ask what you think about the public getting too much of what they want. Obviously, if the studios open up the door 100% to listening to what the public has to offer, then it can go bad. Most of the time, it can go bad. Mostly because people don't necessarily know what they want, but also if you're asking someone to make a version of this movie or a version of this movie, it's not going to live up to the hype that they have in their head. And that makes it really hard when you're examining any film that involves any superheroes because that fan base is so locked into their version of things. I mentioned to you this off air, but the evolution of superheroes. I mean, in my mind, Batman is a 6'4", thick-necked individual like Zack Snyder talks about. But if you look at the beginning of what people accepted as Batman or what people accepted as Superman, that's not anything that the people grow up with now. The evolution of it has changed. They look like completely different human beings.
Yeah, that's yeah, and when it comes to like the over the years and how things change and stuff, yeah, I mean superhero movies weren't really taken seriously or given the same light of day, in the past. And certain movies have helped move that needle. Like the first Christopher Reeve Superman movie did, wonders. I mean, that made it possible to make a comic book superhero movie, and I think people get frustrated because, like nobody, like people get mad because, especially people who are a fan of the Henry Cavill Superman, are so upset because like they say that people are just so obsessed and can't get over the Richard Donner, Christopher Reeve Superman from the 70s and 80s. But I think it's important to realize that like you can like both, like I do. And it's also important to recognize just how important and how that movie was and how successful it was. That era in general was just crazy influential with Star Wars and Jaws, Superman, Indiana Jones. I mean, just there's so many movies that just kind of uh, opened the door of possibilities. I think of the first Batman movie with Michael Keaton. I mean, that was a huge deal. Just celebrated its 35th anniversary. Um, I think about how important those movies were. Uh, and yeah, sometimes a lot of those other movies struggled. The sequels to those movies sometimes really struggled, and it became really goofy again. Uh, but like it added a validity to the genre, and then obviously like when the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight movies came out, hugely successful, grounded, showed what a superhero movie could be. It doesn't have to just be like this campy sort of film, comic booky kind of film. It could be something. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies are kind of a little bit comic booky in a way, but it works for the way that story should be told. At the same time, so can The Dark Knight, right? And then of course the MCU just totally took it to a whole different level, you know, of showing what a movie could be, family friendly. It's almost like a TV show up on the movie screen, with a new episode in the version of a movie coming out, a couple times a year, for 10 years straight. And I just think, yeah, it is crazy how like things have evolved because Christopher Reeve worked out. I mean, he was like super, super skinny before he was Superman, and he worked out to have that physique and that look. But you look at the costume, and it's an iconic costume, but I mean, if Henry Cavill wore that in Man of Steel, like he'd get laughed off the screen, which is really interesting to think about, you know. And Henry Cavill's big bulk, you know, he has that look, of Superman. Like Ben Affleck had that look of a big brawling Batman. But then again, Christian Bale also revered as Batman, and he's smaller more, and so is Robert Pattinson. I mean, he might be uh maybe taller than Christian Bale, but he's not a big brawler. In the certain scenes when he's shirtless in that movie, you can tell that he's not like a big kind of dude. He's more agile. He's more uh quick and efficient and whatnot. So he can be tough and brutal, but he's a little bit slimmer physique. So it is interesting to think about.
Abercrombie and Finch Batman is what we'll call him.
There you go. There you go.
But what are your thoughts on the kind of shock with Smallville? I mean, you had the young boy Superman, teenage high school Superman, and they've brought him back in some crossovers with the newer Superman show. And he's still kind of jacked, but you can tell he's not the same young stud everyone fell in love with when Smallville first came out, which to me is like, I mean, I know you talk a little bit about Smallville as well too, and you like to look into that just because you're a fan of it. I'm a fan of it too, but I watched it, I was like, yeah, man, I was like, if you started putting on like a cape and flying around or trying to do anything like Superman related, that wasn't just you working on a farm and lumberjacking all day, I wouldn't believe it, man. I would just feel so hurt that they brought you back just to kind of, I don't know. I just think it's been too long of time, and everyone only associates him with the Superman, not the older one. So I think it just to me it was interesting. I wanted your take on that.
Yeah. I was a big fan of Smallville, and I still go back sometimes and watch certain episodes and stuff like that. And um, yeah, I mean, such a huge. You can talk about hugely influential superhero show that kind of paved the way to show that hey, superheroes can work on TV. And obviously after Smallville, then we had Arrow, The Flash, all these other superhero shows and stuff that I mean, Smallville really paved the way for that. And because I mean, you could say like, yeah, oh, we had Lois and Clark before that or whatnot, but I don't think it's the same. Smallville ran for 10 seasons. And sure, like the costumes on there were kind of goofy sometimes. But it wasn't like a goofy show. Like, it was kind of like it was taken a little bit more seriously. It was especially like the first half of the show, the first 5 seasons, 5, 6 seasons. It really was kind of set in a more grounded world, where like there's no tights, no flights, like you
Yeah.
mentioned. So like, Tom Welling wasn't going to be flying around, and he wouldn't have signed on to do the show if he was going to be doing stuff like that. Um, so I think, yeah, and then not you mentioned that he was in the big Crisis crossover a few years back. I thought was interesting because I never thought he would come back to do more after Smallville ended. He was so against doing TV stuff after that for a while. Like he only wanted to do movies, and he's like he basically stuck his head in the ground and did like 20 plus episodes of a TV show for 10 years straight. So when that got done, he's like, I don't want to take on a commitment like that again, because he felt like a lot of those years of his life, like you were just kind of lost in a way. And so it was really interesting that, I think as time's gone on, he's been more appreciative. He came back to do the crossover episode, and for those who have seen it, it obviously makes sense why he chose to come back to do that kind of a scene back on the farm. And then just, now he's doing the Talkville podcast with Michael Rosenbaum, and they're going back and rewatching the old Smallville episodes and reliving it, and earned, 20 years later, and can appreciate it and enjoy it in a way. So um I think Smallville doesn't get mentioned enough in terms of how good it was and how influential it was. And it's cool that it's, like with Talkville and whatnot, like there's, you know teasing the idea of doing something animated, some kind of a continuation. We'll see if that ever happens. I'm not gonna hold my breath, but it'd be really cool.
We've talked about a lot about like the Hollywood experience, the movie studios experience, the people's experience, and then the director's experience. But what about the actor's experience? I mean, if you really examine the actor who played Clark in Smallville, and how he became kind of attached to that role. And no one can decipher you really out of it. Like we can't really think about. I mean, Chris Evans can play a wide variety of roles, but everyone's going to start assuming him as Captain America at a point. Robert Downey Jr. is Iron Man. People can see him in other movies because he's a great actor. But then you talk about when it starts off your career on television and you get pigeonholed to a point. I mean, the stress it causes on the actor if you're like, hey, I can do other acting roles. Well, sorry, but I'm not seeing Robert Pattinson as Batman. I'm seeing him as the Twilight guy. That was just a weird thing that happened with his career, much like it's happened to plenty of other actors out there. You don't see the guy from The Fresh Prince, Alfonso. You don't see him playing anybody else besides Carlton. It's just Carlton. It's been synonymously attached to him. So it's very hard when you examine like what the mental games and what it does for a career of an actor that gets placed in these positions. I mean, I think with Smallville is surprisingly unique because not even I think a little bit after that was Heroes. And Heroes was just average people with amazing abilities and stuff like that. But that show, like we don't hear about Hiro Nakamura doing any other acting gigs. He's been in some for sure, but you don't hear about Hiro Nakamura being it, or the other guy played Peter Pacelli. That dude just fell off the map. We saw him in Grown Ups too. That was it for a brief moment next to the guy who played in Twilight, and I can't remember his damn name. Um, but like you don't really see him all over. There used to be drama series. Any of those people that were on those old soapboxes back in the day, they got pigeonholed to those points. Zach Braff is another one. He was on Scrubs. Everyone considered him JD, would call him JD in the streets. And next thing you know, he said it became difficult to play anything he didn't use his voice for. And that's when he picked up Chicken Little.
Yeah. Uh, Taylor Lautner, by the way,
Thank
was
you.
his
Yes,
name.
thank you.
But it is a really interesting thing to think about because, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with George Reeves, right?
Who?
George Reeves?
Is that Chris Reeve's brother?
No. Uh, it's funny because Christopher Reeve is just Reeve. There's no S at the end of his name. His thing was always the S is on his chest. But George Reeves with the S, he played Superman in the 1950s TV show Adventures of Superman, the live action show from back in the day. Um, and he played that character from the early 50s all the way to the late 50s. And it was a huge success. I mean, that's really what put Superman on the map. You know, sure, like the Max Fleischer animated cartoon stuff was really cool and really good. And there was like the radio show and of course the comics. But that George Reeves show really took the popularity of Superman and like how it was such a kid-friendly show. It really was just it was so influential and so it was such a big deal in the pop culture back then. It feels weird to say pop culture in the 50s. But um he the story with him is like it was so he was in other movies, but a lot of times, you know, all of a sudden that it kind of stopped and it kind of hurt his career in a way because people only saw him as Superman. He was so famous for that role that either he wouldn't be able to get into movies he wanted to be in, or like it was just it was very harmful for his career in a sense, to the point where like, after the show had like ended, they wanted to bring it back again. But it was so difficult for him, and then tragically, he then tragically passed away. Um, how he passed away seems to be very hotly debated about, and very controversial. The official record is that he took his own life, but there's a lot of people that think that he didn't. But the prevailing theory is that like he just couldn't find work and he was depressed, and he, to the point where he, potentially may or may not have taken his own life. And there's kind of this what they call the Superman curse after that, where I think Christopher Reeve had a little bit of the same thing, where people always saw him as Superman, but like it wasn't even his favorite role. It wasn't his favorite movie that he had done. He was super, super appreciative of those movies, but like it wasn't like his bread and butter. He didn't grow up a big fan of the character. Christopher Reeve was more into like drama and theater and uh, more character-driven roles and stuff like that. Um, but he was always considered as Superman by people. But that's how people knew him. Even the same with, the guy from Smallville, Tom Welling. To an extent, he was worried about that so much. That's part of why he didn't want to wear the suit and the cape, because for that reason. And even still, like people, when people see him, they think of Smallville. You know, they don't think of the other stuff that he's done. Like he was in the Cheaper by the Dozen movies, with Steve Martin, but they don't remember him for that. They don't remember him for that horrible remake of The Fog. They don't remember him for the Nicholas Sparks movie that he was in. They remember him from Smallville. So, I think there's this, they call it the Superman curse, but it is a big deal because, like, with Chris Evans and, Chris Hemsworth, Robert Downey Jr., sure, they can be really, really great actors, but they are so famous for their superhero roles that that is the first thing that people think of when they see that actor, and it's difficult. And I also just want to say, there was a movie that Tom Welling did with Kevin Costner called Draft Day. It was a football movie, very underwhelming. I was really disappointed because it should have been so much better, unfortunately. But Kevin Costner has a new movie that's coming out that's kind of going against the grain of like the Hollywood structure of, like you mentioned, like the studio system and the actor and filmmaker. And he's actually put a lot of like millions and like tens of millions of dollars, like was it 30 or 40 million, into his own Western that he's making right now and releasing here very shortly, if not, when this, or maybe around the time this episode comes out. It's called Horizon, and he's put so much of his own money into the movie. He doesn't want it financed by studio executives. And I think there's Francis Ford Coppola is making a movie called Megalopolis, I think it's called, where like he's put millions and millions of his own dollars into making his own movie, which I think we're seeing a little bit more of that nowadays, which is really interesting because it's a really big bet. First of all, on to be able to, for one, have the money to do something like that. And like if it's not a success, then look how much money that you're out of too. So it's really interesting. But I would definitely recommend, if you're not familiar with the whole George Reeves thing with the original Superman stuff, to go back and check it out, because it is a big thing. It is really important. When you think of Michael Keaton, you think of Batman. You know, um, when you think of Linda Carter, you think of Wonder Woman. You think of Gal Gadot, you think of Wonder Woman. So I think like it is really interesting because it makes them super popular and super famous, and whatnot. And it does kind of like add a big, huge boost to their career. But then again, that's what they're always going to be known for. So it's a really, really interesting dynamic.
I'll ask you this. What's one thing you can change about the industry, if you could? I mean, out of all the things we've kind of mentioned here, and I'll just give you an example just so you can think about yours for a second. So I'm not throwing you out on the spot there. But I would consider more redemption stories. For instance, Karate Kid. William Zabka was stuck as being this bad guy in the Karate Kid movies and really didn't have a big acting career after that because he was pigeonholed to a position that he played when he was a kid. Ralph Macchio is the kind of the same thing. But then we see the revamp of the show. A lot of people were afraid that it wasn't going to hold up. How are you going to create a show off these movies that we watched? And it completely just resparked an interest in him. It went completely good for the actor, where I think a lot of people would like to see him in other things now because they realize he is just more than a karate guy. He can be anything. He's actually a talented person. I think it's the same thing with the guy from Smallville. I think there's plenty of other positions out there where people have been brought back as a nostalgia thing because they know people would love to see something they haven't seen in 15 and 20 years. And they realize, oh crap, let's give this actor more roles. And that's, just an unintended consequence, but I think the redemption story for me would be something we'd start changing, and also more creative expression when it comes to directors being able to actually put their own image, what they want, not just what the studio tells them they can put in there.
Yeah, I'm with you. That is a real. I'm totally with you on that. I completely agree. For me, it's tough because there's a lot of things that if I could change one thing or whatnot, like there's a lot of things that I um, would love to do, I guess. First thing that comes to my mind, I could have gone down the road of like, I really want to see Ben Affleck do his Batman movie. I really want to see Ray Fisher be successful in Hollywood and get more roles, even get the Cyborg movie that he was originally promised, which I think was just a huge miss on the studio. Like they missed a huge on that. That could have been a huge, huge movie for people with disabilities and being a superhero movie, African American led superhero movie. I think that they really missed out on that with Ray Fisher. But the one thing I would really change would be to uh, enforce regulations to in the name of saving the movie theater industry. That being, for one, having some kind of a uh, standardized thing put into effect where like if you put your movie in the movie theater, it like cannot go to streaming or be available for viewing or purchase for at least, let's say, 2 months, 2 or 3 months. Have that window be secured for movie theaters to be able to get people into the movie theaters to watch the movies. It'll generate more money for studios and for movie theaters. It'll be great for everybody involved. I think that would be the best thing to do in that, you know, for that. So that's one thing I would look at. The other thing was, I mean, I'm such a big fan of physical media. I mean, I try to get us, that's my preferred way to do it because in that case, like if it's on streaming, it could disappear or go to a different streaming service, and then you can't watch it, you know? Even if you technically like purchase a digital version that's like not iTunes, like let's say like you know, choose to like rent or buy a movie on Amazon or whatever, you're only buying the access to be able to watch that movie. That could still disappear. So the only way you can really truly own a movie is by getting it on physical media. And then of course you get special features and it's higher quality in general. So I'm always such a big physical media guy. I wish there was a more of an emphasis on physical media. Um, Especially in today's day and age, I feel like it would be really cool and really important, I feel like to get more of an emphasis on that. Um, to more of a bit of a focus on that.
People would spend thousands of dollars on box sets, and now they don't get anything.
Yes. And that's what I really like about a lot of these filmmakers, like, Denis Villeneuve, Zack Snyder, Christopher Nolan, especially. They will put so much in James Cameron. They'll put so much emphasis into the release of like making sure there's lots of special features and stuff like that. And there's a lot of care put into the movie itself. And I think I wish there was more of an emphasis on that. Um, but it's tough because then it's like it's really tough. I know I'm really crossing my fingers and hoping that like you're saying, like a lot of times like in the past they've been able to, make the sort of necessary adjustments to keep things moving forward. Um, I worry about the movie theater industry, and that's something that I would really look at doing to kind of preserve, to help, and also it'd be one thing if like if a lot of these movie theater chains and whatnot could help enforce like and make it a good experience, you know? And I know it's tough, like because financially they're struggling, and people a lot of times will have, a better quality picture and sound in their own house, in their own apartment. Like with TVs that are out nowadays, I mean, for the price that some of these 4K TVs are out there for, you can get such a great experience at your house that you just can't. It's so tough to replicate in a movie theater for that. Sure, it's a big screen and you have a lot of, big sound. Um, but like also with like enforcing things like, hey, can we not have people on their phones and talking and all this kind of nonsense? And if they are, can you kick them out? Kind of a thing. I think sometimes they're afraid to do stuff like that because there's so few people that are there anyway
Yeah.
that they're afraid of turning more people away from coming back. But you have to have standards. You have to have something that like, hey, like we're better than this. And if we can get to a point where like people are comfortable going back to a movie theater again, and it's not overpriced or it's not, going to be a bad experience, where it'll be more of a fun experience, a communal experience, the way it's supposed to be, I think uh only good can come from that for all parties.
Well, Darren, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show again, man. I know we were going to have an overall cinema experience talking. I think we did that here today for sure. I definitely don't think we're solving the industry in a matter of an hour or so, but I do appreciate you giving me your thoughts on it and just interest as a fan in general. You gave me some very good, valid points to think about. And obviously, I think about this a little bit too, just as a experiencer of these films. Where can people find your links, Darren, to your books and also to your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you, and I apologize if I uh, talk too much or rant too much or
You did
whatever.
beautifully. I
Uh,
loved it.
cool. Okay. Well, for me, the best place you can find me online would probably be my website, which is oakvalleymedia.llc.com. You can email us if you have any thing that you would like to talk about. Otherwise, like for social media, the place I'm most active is probably Twitter, slash X, whatever you want to call it. I don't even know anymore. Uh, Daryn_Kirscht. I'm on there. As for like, the books, they're all on Amazon. If you go on the website, there's links on there as well. For the podcast, the link is on the website as well. And we also have a Patreon. If people want to help support the show, that would be super awesome. Hopefully at some point, maybe later this year or at some point next year, I can get back to doing the next season and do more episodes of the podcast and go from there. But that's probably the best place to find me.
Well, I'll make sure I link all those links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.